Hi, everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel and this bonus episode of Life After Diets podcast. I'm here with Becca. Becca came with me to India. We did our yoga teacher training. We've been back now a week and a half. Becca's been back a day longer, but we won't talk about that. But this conversation came as a request from our podcast listeners because I've spoken about my experiences in India on the YouTube channel around food and body image, and Steph and I recorded a podcast episode. And of course, you were a big part of that, Becca. You were that we spent every minute together for 3.5 weeks. And people are curious about our dynamics and what you experienced as well, because we are both in recovery from eating issues. There are certain words that we're not going to use on this video because YouTube doesn't like it and we'll end up getting this video restricted. So if it sounds a bit strange that we're not saying the actual words for eating problems, bear with us. It's just so that this video can be more visible. But hi, Becca. How are you feeling after you're back? Because you were very poorly when you got back.
Yeah, I caught a virus on the way back, and I'm feeling much better now. Thank you. That first week when I got home was a bit of a blur. Yeah, also thank you for the lovely introduction. I feel like you've bigged it up now, like with it as a bonus episode, and I hope I don't disappoint.
No, there's less pressure for a bonus episode because it's like it didn't make it as a regular episode, but also it doesn't feel right doing it as a regular episode without our Steffi.
Absolutely, that's fine. I feel more comfortable with it like that.
So there were a few topics that I haven't spoken about yet on the channel or with Steph on the podcast. Some of that is around weight loss because ultimately we were very much outside of our usual routine with food. I was certainly eating less than I normally would and was being required to push my body harder. So there were changes in my weight, and I know you've had changes in your weight, and that's been a tricky subject, which we will come back to later. But the other thing I can't believe I didn't talk about, and I didn't mean to omit it, but before I start, I want to issue some trigger warnings. Becca and I might be talking about some sensitive topics in this conversation. We're definitely going to talk about vomiting, being sick. So if that's difficult to hear, have a look in the notes below because I will make a list of any triggering topics and the timestamps. So please have a look at the notes below before you continue watching or listening to this video/podcast. Would you like to tell the listeners what vamen dhouti is?
Oh, okay. So vamen dhouti was an experience. So vamen dhouti is a type of, I think it's a shakkarma, they call it, which is a type of cleansing technique in yogic philosophy. And it's a cleansing technique for the gastrointestinal tract. And basically, what Vaman involves is drinking warm salt water and drinking a large amount of this until the person feels like they need to vomit. And when it gets to that stage, the individual would then self-induce vomit to regurgitate this salt water with the idea that the salt water is then cleansing the gastrointestinal. So that's just a description of it. That's not saying I believe in it or I actually think it is a cleansing technique or it works, but that's what it is in yogic philosophy, and that's the belief behind it.
And Becca and I both have a history of an eating problem that has involved binging and self-induced vomiting. So we were kind of horrified. I was horrified anyway when I saw this on the syllabus. And we're taken up to this rooftop, and there's this huge porcelain basin, probably about 6 foot wide in diameter, with this sloping down to this plug and this big vat of warm salt water. And everybody is invited to try to do this. To be fair, there wasn't a lot of pressure. We were not pressured into doing it. And I just quietly didn't, but I think you went and said something to the teacher, didn't you?
I Sarah's right, there wasn't a lot of pressure, it was optional. But in the build up to it, I think there've been a few times whilst being in India where I had my boundaries violated or they hadn't been listened to. So I had kind of a bubbling sort of anxiety that if I said I didn't want to participate in the Vaman Dhouti, that that kind of wouldn't be listened to, and there would be a little bit of pressure enforced on me to do it. And I really didn't want to be in that situation because I knew that would make me feel really uncomfortable. So I actually spoke to the teacher beforehand and gave a very brief history of my eating issues, and why I didn't want to. Did well there, didn't I? And why I didn't want to take part in the vamen dhouti. And he was very understanding and agreed that he didn't think it was something I should do. I was grateful for that, and I was pleasantly surprised by that response. But there also was no kind of discussion about this beforehand to the rest of the group to kind of sort of say to people that if you have had a history of eating issues like this, then this is not a practice that should be done, which I feel like that should have been raised, because before doing it, there was disclaimers that if anyone has a stomach hernia or a stomach ulcer or anything like that, then this practice shouldn't be done. And I feel like the mention of eating issues should have been included in that, to give people a warning and to protect people ultimately, and it wasn't there. So yeah, I was also very much in shock when we witnessed this, and it can only be described, I would describe it as just a special vomit sink. That's basically what this big circular thing was on top of a building. It was like a vomit sink. It was very bizarre. And I think, Sarah, you were there for the whole experience. You stayed to kind of witness everyone doing it right through to the end, and then you came down with people at the end. I didn't. I did stay there for the beginning because I did want to challenge myself to stay in that environment and try to witness it from a different perspective. But about halfway through, I personally found it too difficult to witness, that I then left and kind of met up with people a little bit later.
What came up for you, excuse the expression, when you were watching other people doing this?
I think you asked me this actually when we were there, like later on that day, how did you feel? And I didn't really have words. Like this, it was such a bizarre experience that it was very difficult to put words to it. I think there was some just absolute disbelief that I'm in this environment and I'm actually witnessing this happening, because it's not something I ever would have imagined happening in my life. I was also catching myself being quite like judgmental towards this as a cultural practice, and really had to try and step out of that and try to remove my own bias because of my own past experience and what I associate this practice with, to try and see it from like the yogic perspective, which admittedly I did find quite difficult, but I wanted to still try to do that so I wasn't being completely affected by my own history. I felt uncomfortable. It was a very uncomfortable thing to watch. I wouldn't say I felt like triggered. I wouldn't use the word triggered, but there was a couple of times when, in particular, the teacher, because the teacher demonstrated this first, where I felt vulnerable for him, because for me, with my history, self-induced vomiting is a very, very vulnerable, raw thing, and for him to present that and do that in front of other people, I really felt that vulnerability. I don't know whether he actually viewed it like that, because his relationship with that practice is different to mine. But that's what I felt kind of on his behalf. And then in particular, when he'd finished, I think the thing I found the hardest was actually seeing his eyes and the kind of the wateriness of his eyes and the almost bloodshot look that he had in his eyes. And that was when I really felt like I kind of need to remove myself a little bit from this, because that kind of brought me back to that experience myself and seeing my own eyes like that, and that kind of represented for me. So yeah, that a lot of mixed emotions, really. I don't know about you, Sarah. What did it bring up for you? Because you stayed there for the full thing, and I know our history is slightly different, because my history did involve more self-induced vomiting than yours, I believe. So I just wondered how it was for you.
Yeah, that moment when Vishnu was the name of our teacher, when he
Yeah.
looked up after he'd done it and his eyes were all watery and he's like, see? And he's just smiling, like really proud of himself. And because he looked like he'd been crying from it, I just wanted to go and give him a hug and go, are you okay? In the handbook, we spoke about it at the time as well. It said one of the benefits of this was to relieve emotional distress. And we were just
Mhm.
like, wow. Because yes, like vomiting and self-induced vomiting, it can actually calm the nervous system down. It can often be a way of managing emotions, and that was kind of being acknowledged. And as a benefit, like, yay, do this practice. For me, there was a slight, almost morbid curiosity about watching this. And I found myself watching people doing it closely,
Mm.
almost like thinking, have they done this before? Have they struggled with eating stuff? Has this been a problem? I think for me, the first guy, there was a guy in our class who was very keen to be first at everything. He was straight in there. And as he was vomiting, there was like red and brown coming out. So there was blood coming out. And were you there for this bit?
Yes, I did see this
And
bit, and I
and
found
Vish,
this difficult.
yeah, Vishnu, the tutor, is like cheering and going like, great, that's all the pitta coming out. That's the toxins coming out. That's this, that's that. That's really good. That's really good. And obviously you and I are a bit like, well, this doesn't seem good to me. But also I found out later he nicked the back of his throat with his nails because he has really long nails. And actually it was just from a cut in the back of his throat. But it was that kind of, I don't know, cheering on. I also thought I had a pretty strong stomach and that I would be fine, but I did notice my own gag reflex going a couple of times when I was watching that. So I think for me, there was a slight fascination. I felt disturbed by it, but kind of compelled at the same time, almost like when you see something horrible, but you just can't look away. It was a little bit like that for me, I think. And I didn't quite stay to the end. It got to a point where I was just kind of struggling, I think, with my own gag reflex wanting to go. And this was before breakfast. So you do this on an empty stomach. But
Yeah.
it was a very, very strange experience and a very, very strange thing,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
it was. And going back to what you said about it releasing emotions, and we were both very baffled by that. Something I found difficult in that experience was people who had done it talking about how great they felt after, and they're like, oh, but you feel really
Mm.
good, like you feel really light, you feel like refreshed, you feel like you've released something. And I was there being like, yeah, I know, like I did this for many years, I know that you can feel all of those things, but for me that's the danger in it. If I was to feel that again, I wouldn't want to make that association between all of these positive sensations and, for me, what is actually a very disordered behavior. I found that difficult, and that was one of the reasons why I didn't want to get too involved in it, because I personally know where making that association with this being a positive thing can lead, and the danger of that.
Yes. The other thing I guess we came across in terms of yoga training and food was, and we see this in the Western world as well. We did it in India, so it was very traditional practices that we were learning, and these are ancient practices that are passed down through these gurus. And that is the whole wellness part of it and the emphasis put on food and food leading to health. Because the the way it was presented to us is that if you just do the physical practice of yoga and you eat like this, you will have perfect health. You'll have brilliant health. Like that is almost this guaranteed thing. And I'm going to forget the names of the foods, but foods are divided into three categories, aren't they? So sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic.
Yeah, well
Yeah.
remembered.
Now, I'm someone who doesn't like a lot of spice. Becca does like her spice and was told that that was just going to make her words spicy and make her too horny.
Which, depending on the person, may not be a bad thing. But yeah, I mean, for me, so just for like a brief overview of what sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic foods are, the idea is that in yogic philosophy, they encourage you to eat sattvic foods because these are natural whole foods from the earth, and think was it Rajsic foods are like pungent, spicy foods. So these should be restricted because of the reasons that Sarah's just said. You'll be horny and just spicy with your words. And Tamsic foods, what were Tamsic foods? I think they were the fermented foods. Anyway,
Rotten foods. I mean, not many people are choosing to eat rotten food anyway, but I think didn't they include alcohol in
yes,
Tamsic?
alcohol are included in Tamsic foods, and also meat and fish, because the idea that once the animal's dead, it's then eaten. For me, it wasn't so much. I appreciate what you're saying around like that association with if you eat these, then you automatically have good health. So that there was that connection there. For me, it was more the morality that was added to these foods. So it was like if you eat these foods, you're a good person, and if you eat these foods, then you're a bad person. Because these foods were also the belief was that if you eat sattvic foods, then you prana, the life force in your body, is more balanced, and then it can help towards leading you to become enlightened. So for me, that was a difficult concept to get my head around because it verged on that like diet culture mentality of these foods are good, you're a good person if you eat these, and if you eat these, then you're a bad person, and you shouldn't do that. So I found that difficult to really buy into. And there was also kind of like a hierarchy because I really appreciate that one of the students asked to the monk, I think I can't remember whether it was Krishna or Shiva or Buddha, but it was some enlightened being who did eat a lot of fish, I think. And they kind of asked the monk, you know, what about this person? And they ate a lot of like Tamsic foods. So, that doesn't fit with the belief that we should only eat sattvic foods. And the monk's kind of answer to that was that, well, once you achieve a certain level of enlightenment, then you don't have to follow these rules. You can do what you want. But it's when you're not enlightened, that's when you need to follow these rules around food. And so there was this feeling of like, well, these people are superior and these people are inferior. So there's some kind of hierarchy, and food is connected to that hierarchy, which again, I really didn't like that belief system. And I think even among this, like we had multiple teachings around Tamsic, Rajsic, and Sattvic foods. And depending on the teacher, we also got told different things. So depending on the teacher, one teacher said that like yogurt, for example, is sattvic because it's a natural product, and then another teacher would say no, it's tamsic because it's fermented, it's rotten, and you shouldn't eat as much of it. So there was again this real contradiction and this conflict in information that we were being told, which for me felt quite close to when you're in that diet mentality, like in the diet culture. Like the one diet says you need to follow this, and that's the best diet for you. And then this other diet says, actually, no, you got to follow these rules, and these will be the best for you. And those two pieces of information like are conflicting with each other, and it just creates this confusion. And it was all just too similar to that for me. And it was really interesting to see that kind of teaching outside of like the Western world and diet culture, and see it in this kind of environment. I found that very fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting the bits that stuck with you compared to me, because I'd forgotten about all the teaching around that sort of sense of superiority. These types of food will make you a better person, and these types of food will make you a worse person. I think because my brain just immediately rejected that. It's almost like it didn't even go in. I was like, what a load of nonsense. It just does not tie in with my belief system. So I think that's why I didn't even remember that until you said it. I was thinking about it more in terms of what they were saying about health, because that's probably the bit that's more not affecting for me, because I didn't feel particularly affected by it. But the notion that certain foods are physically, I don't even want to know how to sort of say this in the nuanced way, but we know that some foods are more health promoting than other foods. There's a reality to that. So for me, it's knowing where that line is, because I also need the freedom, and I need an all foods fit approach. And I need to know that I can have all the different foods as well. And I still recognize that some foods are more health promoting, have a higher nutrient content than other foods. And so for me, holding that balance, when people are going too far into this is what you need to eat, you should only be eating these highly nutritious foods, that's the bit for me that my brain has to go like, I get that. I can't argue with the physical health side of things, but I need to bring in, there's a psychological health for me around food and emotional health for me around food that I have to take care of.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And I think my experience with that kind of food connected to health was really interesting for me to witness, because I hold the same belief system as you, that all foods need to, be allowed, they all need to have their place. And when we were having those teachings around like certain foods and how they, in particular, this was more in like the anatomy class for me, when we were learning about certain foods and how they can promote like the health of the cell in the body, I instantly felt resistance. I instantly just wanted to be like, this is bullshit. I'm not listening to this. And then I caught myself doing that and realizing that was because for me, in my recovery journey, I did have to move away from viewing foods as like connected to health, because that is what gave me freedom, and viewing health in a more holistic way rather than just physical health. So recognizing, oh, well, these foods do play a role because they help with this aspect of health, not just physical. So for me, I needed to kind of move away from that physical health association. So I think when in the teachings they were talking about food and how it was connected to physical health, I instantly felt resistance because it threatened what health looked like for me and what had worked for me in my recovery. So I don't know whether people would have listened to the podcast episode where you and Steph talk about like the anti-diet identity. And I recognized that's what was going on for me there. There was like an attachment to being anti-diet, instantly rejected any teachings around like food being connected to physical health. But when I recognized that and sat with it, I also had to admit to myself that some of the teachings that they were saying were actually correct and they were accurate. Like what the woman wasn't teaching us false information around how food can affect your physical health, but she was only talking about one isolated part of health. The rest of it wasn't being brought into the discussion. And so it's like my belief around holistic health was true, and also what she was saying was true. The two things were true, and I didn't need to have that kind of resistance that initially came up for me. So it was a very interesting experience for me to witness that in myself and that reaction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was certainly very challenging and certainly brought up a lot of things for me, just being there and feeling extremely vulnerable a lot of the time, because my body didn't feel like it was doing what I wanted it to be able to do, which kind of nicely moves us on to comparison and how that showed up. And because there were several classes that I needed to sit out because I was in physical pain or because I wasn't well. And when I was sitting out the classes and I'm watching everybody doing the yoga, I'm watching what it looks like to me. What I'm seeing is people really enjoying pushing their body. And I had a bit of sadness about that, because I was thinking, I just don't enjoy, I can sometimes, but I just never, that's very black and white. I'm gonna like scratch that. I mean, I'll leave it in, but I'll just scratch that. I struggle to trust how far I can push my body, because sometimes I can get excited and about being able to push my body and enjoy pushing it to the limits. And then I've talked about it this way before. It's like my body pushes back. So watching other people, there was one time where I was sitting, that was the Ashtanga class when you were all practicing headstands. And one person in the group was really struggling to get into this headstand and she was falling out of it. And it looked really uncomfortable. She was having a difficult time and she kept going back and going back and going back. And then she called the teacher over and was like, can you help with this? And she was going again and going again. And I'm watching her and I'm thinking, if that was me, when I tumbled out of it the second or third time, and she landed quite hard when she tumbled out of it, I was like, I wouldn't be doing that again. So I'm admiring this quality in other people and judging myself a bit for feeling like I don't have that in the same way. And also on Deepak's class, the second class we'd have of the day, I think I mentioned this to you briefly, at the time, there would be this big build-up of body conditioning into normally like one particular pose, slightly challenging pose that we were going to be practicing. So we would have this build-up of like 30-40 minutes of building strength, or as what it felt like for me, expending strength, and then expected to get in these difficult positions. But then we were often told, oh, pair up with someone or pair up with a couple of people and practice it. So it was like this free, unstructured playtime, if you like. And I'm watching other people enjoy this playtime. I'm like, I just want to be on my mat being told exactly what to do. That's what I enjoy. And I found it difficult to feel like it was playful for me. And I just found it a little bit stressful. I found it stressful having someone supporting me in poses at times. And so that bit came up for me. It felt like everybody, this was the comparison piece, felt like everybody was loving that. And I was just, can we just do a normal hatha class, please, where we go from pose to pose to pose? And it just wasn't like that.
Yeah. See, I was probably in that camp that did love that approach to the lessons and that free play time. So I can't relate to the comparison in the same way. Comparison did show up for me when I was there, but it didn't show up for me in like the movement and body in the way that
That's because you were smashing it. You were smashing it, Becca.
I was trying. I was trying.
You were. You got so much, your body became so much strong. You could see you getting stronger in what you were doing and more flexible in what you were doing. It was so noticeable, the strides that you were making.
Well, thank you. But for me, comparison didn't show up in that area, but comparison did show up in like an intellectual sense, I suppose, more in the sense of like what was going on in my mind for me. So, Sarah, I don't think you've actually heard this until today. So you're getting the real reaction from Sarah. If we keep it in, that is anyway. Um, Comparison didn't show up for me in terms of me comparing myself to everyone else. Comparison showed up for me in terms of me comparing myself to you. And this was in particular in like the philosophy class. And so I view you as someone who is naturally quite philosophical and is able to like take these philosophical teachings and make sense of them very quickly and quite easily have an opinion on what feels true for you and what doesn't, and have confidence in that, and also then this really good ability to be able to take philosophical teachings and apply them to everyday life and in particular mental health. And it's something I really admire in you, but it's also something I have an insecurity in myself that I don't feel like I'm very good at that. So I don't feel like I'm naturally a very philosophical person, or it takes me quite a long time to really understand philosophical teachings. And I have an insecurity around like how to apply that to everyday context. So when we were having these philosophy lessons, and you just seem to understand it straight away and seem to be able to apply it to situations straight away. And I just didn't. And that was where I started to feel like comparison and feel like inferior, or feel like I'm not very good at this kind of stuff. And I'm not good at making like a fixed opinion on what my belief is around it. So that's where the comparison came up for me. And I don't know how that feels for you to hear that.
It feels okay. I feel like you've kind of alluded to it in other ways. I guess the only one I'm thinking of is when we were talking about one of the 8 limbs of yoga and what it meant, withdrawal of the senses, what that looked like. And I gave the example of your mobile phones, for example, that idea of withdrawing from distraction, being able to put our phones down. Is that the kind of thing that you mean, where I was taking what they were saying from the ancient perspective and plonking it in the modern?
Yeah, you have a really good way of being able to plonk it into the modern, as you say. And I find that a little bit more difficult to do. Or I think I have a tendency to take a teaching and like just take it at face value, whereas you have this ability to be able to take it and kind of be like, well, what's the real message in that, and how can that be applied, and that sort of thing I find a bit more difficult to do. So I think that's where the comparison came up for me, and I had some insecurity about talking about how I felt around some of the philosophical teachings, because I didn't want to be like, I don't understand this. And you're thinking, oh, you're stupid.
Oh,
That
I
you
would
would
have
ever
loved
do
to
that.
have helped and had those conversations because I love
Yeah.
talking about those kinds of things. It's quite interesting to me. But you talk about taking everything at face value, but that's not what I saw at all. I saw you asking a lot of questions. You're wrestling with you're asking questions. I think that your approach, and I said this a bit in the last week's podcast episode, is much more open. Whereas I'm like, no, this is how I see it. Full stop.
I see that perspective, I do, but from my perspective of my insecurity around this, I'm like, well, Rebecca's just really wishy-washy. She hasn't decided what she believes. And Sarah's like got some firm opinions and she's found her own truth and belief system, and I respect that. So it's really funny to see how you perceive that and how that came up for me in the comparison that brought up for me.
Well, on this side of things, the comparison for me then was, boy, you're a hard worker, Becca. Like Becca was studying. It would be 9:30, 10 p.m. I'm like, is it okay if we turn the light out now? Can you use your mobile phone torch? And Becca's like, yeah, sure. And then she's reading over the notes for the day. So there were times where I felt this sort of twang of, I was like guilt that you were working so hard and I felt like I wasn't. A kind of occasionally a bit of a sense of like, oh, am I being a bit lazy? I'm never the person who studies a lot.
You don't need to. You just turn up to the lessons and it goes in and you get it. Whereas I had to put that effort into it and pretend
No,
it, I
you could
feel.
reel. No, I'm not having that. When we were doing the study groups, like you could reel the stuff off like this, and name it, and I couldn't. Most people couldn't. But you learned a lot of stuff that you then didn't even need for the exam, and I would
I
have been
know.
gutted. But you were like, "Well, I'm glad I learned it," and I was like, "That's a great attitude." Wouldn't be mine, but I think that's a great attitude to have.
Yeah, it's fun. It's really interesting to just see how you perceive the same thing very differently to me. And also when you say that you were sitting out of classes and what was coming up for you around that comparison. And I know you've said this to me individually. I think you said it on the other podcast as episode with Steph as well, that there was this feeling that people would be thinking that you're sitting out because you're lazy or you can't be bothered
Yes.
or you're not interested. And that never even crossed my mind at all when you were sat out. For me, it was like, oh, okay, obviously for you in this class right now, the best thing for you to do or the right thing for you to do is to not participate. It never ever crossed my mind that actually that was lazy. For me, it was like, oh, Sarah's listening to her body and she knows what she needs. Again, Sarah has a clear vision of what her body needs and what it doesn't need, and she's doing that. So it was not interpreted in the way that you were probably worrying that it was.
Yeah. Yeah. And just feeling like I'm left out of something, and yeah, it was a horrible feeling to be sitting out of the classes. A horrible feeling. Just, yeah. Anyway, then we came back. First of all, how was the food for you? Because I know I spoke about, I felt very unsatisfied a lot. I could kind of fill myself up on the food and we were allowed to have as much as we wanted. But because it was all very sort of sloppy texture and it was all vegetarian meals, there was very little crunch, very little fresh vegetables, raw vegetables, very little fruit. We had some fruit sometimes. I was okay for a couple of weeks, but that last week and a half, every lunchtime and dinner time, I was hungry, so I was ready to eat. And there was a sense of dread of having to sit with those metal trays and eat this food again.
Yeah. I think for me with the food, I really miss texture was a huge thing for me. Like you say, it was all kind of a similar sort of texture. It was all kind of rice and dal. It was all a very sort of sludgy, sloppy kind of texture, which that texture in itself I don't dislike, but I did lack having a variety of texture, particularly like crunchiness. And I really missed eating meat, which really surprised me because I've only actually started eating meat within the last year because I was vegetarian or vegan pretty much the majority of my life. And I did really miss not having that kind of substance of meat in my meals. And I like the chew is required to eat meat. Something I noticed that I'm a very savory person in my palate. Like I naturally just prefer savory. But towards the end, especially the last week or so, I really needed something sweet after a meal. And there wasn't this kind of like urgency or like uncontrollable desire for sweet things, but there was this feeling that if I didn't have something sweet after eating a meal, but the meal didn't feel complete, it needed something like that for me, which was interesting because that's not something I usually feel with meals as much. Hunger wise, I didn't ever feel really hungry when I was there. I feel like my appetite really dropped, which was surprising considering how much movement we were doing, and how long the days were. But I do think that my appetite really started to tail off towards the end of our time there. And I don't know if I've really fully got that appetite back yet. I have noticed even since I've been home that my appetite has just been generally lower and my interest in food has been a little bit lower as well. So yeah, the time I struggled the most with the food was actually when I was like premenstrual and menstruating. That was when I found it the hardest. I really needed something different. And it wasn't even just a different food. I needed my own space to eat. I didn't want to eat in this big hall with lots of people out of these trays. I just wanted to eat on my own. I did. I went and got a pizza that day. And I've thoroughly enjoyed that pizza. I've never taken so long to eat a pizza and savored it so much because it was just such a magical experience. But that was really when I found the most difficulty around food was when I was menstruating. Mm.
Yes. Yeah, we snuck out and you got a pizza takeaway and I got a pesto grilled cheese sandwich. Oh, and it was just so good. It makes me really happy just thinking about that. How did you feel on it was the last day when someone at the yoga thing started pointing around going, "Oh, you've lost weight, you've lost weight, you've lost weight," and she pointed at you, said you'd lost weight, she pointed at me, said I'd lost weight, and she pointed at one other person and announced in front of all these other people, these three people have lost weight. How did
Mm.
you feel in that moment when she did that?
I felt uncomfortable. I did feel a bit uncomfortable being singled out like that because then naturally people are going to look at you and they're going to start like making that comparison to how I look now and well at the time and then at the beginning. And I didn't like feeling like people were looking at me and they were analyzing my body. I felt exposing. At that time, I felt like I maybe had lost a little bit of weight, but I wasn't sure because we didn't have scales, we hadn't weighed ourselves, it just hadn't been an option. But I could feel in my body like I feel like I have lost some weight. And I do think that her comments on that day and some other people's comments, because it was not just that one time, there was some another time someone else said, "Oh, you've lost weight." But that then did sort of plant the seed in my mind of when I get back, I'm going to weigh myself to see if I've lost weight. It planted a seed of curiosity, which I'm not sure whether I would have felt that as much if I hadn't had that comment. So I may have been aware that something felt different in my body, but not had that curiosity and desire to want to go and weigh myself and just see how much I had lost. That makes sense. So I think it planted that a little bit for me. How did you feel? Because you were also in that camp of people she singled out as having lost weight.
I think inside there was a bit of an inner eye roll because also we were wearing different clothes. We were in our dresses for the
Mm.
closing ceremony. It didn't really bother me to any kind of great extent. Obviously, it was the first person who had made a comment. And from my perspective, it was strange because I didn't feel like my clothes felt any different. I wasn't feeling like that my clothes fit differently or anything like that. But there was one particular yoga pose that felt very different. And I thought, oh, my body feels like this in this pose. It feels smaller. And that was for me what made me think, okay, I think I have. But it was just from that one pose. And so then, we've had a couple of voice notes about this. We haven't spoken about it in a conversation way. I get back from India on the Monday and I'm staying with my friend, our mutual friend, Carly, who's also a therapist. And on the Wednesday, I'm just thinking about it. And it's this curiosity thing. And we did an episode on scales. And for me, I do weigh myself. I weigh myself once every couple of months. And it's not a big deal. It's information for me. And I'm always conscious to check in with how, do I feel emotionally invested in what I'm about to see? And I really get my head in a this is sort of a factual situation thing. So I decided to weigh myself, and I got on the scales, and I'd lost more than I would have expected. And so I saw the number on the scales and I was like, that's interesting. And it just felt like information. I'm watching to see if there's like an emotional reaction to this. I'm not sensing an emotional reaction to this. So I thought, okay, that's just information. Didn't think much of it. That was on the Wednesday. And then I came to Bournemouth on the Sunday, and I'm staying with another friend. I'm there at the moment. And on Tuesday, I think it was this week, or was it Monday? I think it was Tuesday. She had some scales in her bathroom, and I thought, oh, I'll just have a look. I'll just have a look and see. Now, for me to weigh myself twice in 1 week is not something I've done for a long time. But in my mind, I'm like, oh no, I'm just interested. This is just information. I can handle whatever the scale says. And I get on the scales, and the number that came up was 5 pounds heavier than the number 6 days ago. And I noticed my mind had a reaction to that. Also conscious as well that I'm on different scales, but it felt like a big difference. And I'm then looking at what my mind goes, well, what have I eaten? I thought I haven't been eating more than usual. I was concerned that I would come back and want to eat everything in sight, and I haven't felt like that since being back. So there was a moment, and I was just watching myself, and I felt the disappointment, and I didn't think I was invested in what I'd seen the week before. And that was humbling. And that was like, there was judgment that came in for even having a reaction. Like, you're not supposed to care about this stuff. You've been in recovery for a long time. You've done a lot of work on this. You've really let go of this stuff. And it came back a bit. And that was tricky, because then the next day I was like, well, I just need to see if the scale says anything. And I'm like, Sarah, what is going on? And so I've had to make an agreement with myself, because even this morning when I was in the bathroom, my eyes wandered to the scale, and I was like, Sarah, you're invested. And that for me is how I know when weighing is not a good idea, is if I feel invested in the outcome. And I know that for whatever's going on for me at the moment, there is some sense of investment of wanting to maintain this. And I even noticed the thought of going like, oh, well, if I can sort of unintentionally lose weight in 3.5 weeks, maybe I could just carry on unintentionally losing weight. And I'm just watching this play out and trying to acknowledge it, because what I did last week was I pushed it to the back, and I made out that it wasn't information that affected me at all. And then have realized, oh, it has affected me. Oh, I feel like a flush of like just something in my body, even just saying that out loud. I haven't said that out loud in this way until now. Why not do it in a public forum? It's like a compulsion to share everything, honestly.
I really relate to what you say about that as well, because I mean, I at one point in recovery, I got rid of scales. I didn't have them. I didn't own them. They weren't even in my house or anything. And then I probably got scales. It was about 2.5 years ago now, actually, was when I reintroduced scales back into my home. And that wasn't, it was, I needed to have scales because I needed to weigh myself for a certain medical reason. So I purchased scales, and I didn't feel an attachment to having them in the house, and I didn't compulsively weigh myself. Whereas I had a real attachment to weighing when I was struggling with my eating issues. I would weigh myself multiple times a day. So I was very wary of introducing scales again when I did. And pleasantly, I hadn't found much of an attachment. Like you say, I would maybe weigh myself once every couple of months, and it was just purely information, and there was no real attachment. Whether my weight had gone up or down, that was fine. And so it's been interesting for me to have come back and to have weighed myself and seen the weight loss, which was unintentional. And I actually felt quite jarred by the weight loss and how significant it was. That I, if I had lost the amount of weight that I have intentionally within that time frame, I'd be really concerned. I'd be quite concerned by how significant it was. But obviously, it wasn't intentional, and it was just a byproduct of the change in our lifestyle that time. And I haven't weighed myself repeatedly. I've weighed myself probably twice since getting back. But I definitely can feel there's an element of wanting to grasp onto it a little bit, like wanting to maintain it. There's no desire to continue to lose weight, but there is this feeling of like, oh, I wonder if we can maintain that, which is not kind of a little voice or little idea that it feels very comfortable for me to have. But I'm also being aware of it and observing it and watching it and what it does at the moment. So yeah, quite similar. It's been an interesting experience. It's not, if someone had said to me before you go, before I went, what do you think will be like the challenges? It would have been, I fear that I'd struggle without the freedom of when I can eat my foods and what foods I eat and being able to cook myself and the lack of availability of certain foods. And I would have thought that returning, the difficulty I'd be faced with is having that like urgency around foods that I haven't been able to eat for the last month and just kind of having to check in with that. And that actually hasn't come up for me. I wouldn't have thought that thing I'd be faced with is unintentional weight loss and managing how I feel about that, but not just how I feel about that, but also how I feel about other people commenting on it, because a lot of people have commented on it since I got home. And I think that makes it a little bit more difficult to navigate because you're not just kind of dealing with your own reaction to this weight loss, but I'm also dealing with a reaction to other people and how do I respond to that reaction to some other people. And so far, my approach with that has been to acknowledge it because it's truth, but then just move on to talking more about my experience of what it was like to be in yoga for the teacher training, rather than focusing on like the weight loss itself. And I can see that there's some kind of discomfort in other people when I don't follow the train of conversation that they want, where they want to talk about the weight loss and I don't entertain that, and I can see the discomfort in other people as well.
I recognize that it could be a bit problematic, but it's nice being able to get into certain yoga poses that I couldn't before. I could never bind before, and I've been able to do a couple of the binds, and that's nice that my body can do that. It feels good to be able to do that, and that's as a result of my body changing shape a bit.
Mm-hmm. You've been really honest in admitting that, because we do this work on body image and moving away from like glamorizing weight loss and all of that. And you've done a lot of work on it. I've done a lot of work on it, and that's why you're in the role that you are, supporting people with it. Sometimes this conditioning around weight loss goes so deep because, in particular for me, it's not something it's something that I was taught from like a real young age from society and people around me, that weight loss is a good thing. That I think when something's been so deeply ingrained like that, it can always have the potential to come back up. And we get to a point in our like lives where we decide, okay, I'm going to reject that belief system and I'm not going to entertain that. But it can still be in there somewhere, that it's more like a lifelong journey of just recognizing it and choosing to not entertain it, rather than never having that belief ever again. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think that's very true. And there's part of me that's like, no, I want to be the person that is completely unaffected by this stuff. And I don't feel compelled to try to change the way I eat. I don't feel compelled to try to eat less or anything like that. And that's the bit kind of to watch out for. So I'm making sure that my meals are hearty and satisfying. And I'm really, really enjoying food since I've been back. Everything just tastes amazing. Like everything tastes amazing. All the foods I like just taste 10 times better since being back. And that hasn't worn off yet. So I'm feeling so satisfied and I'm feeling so good when I eat. And that's good because, as I mentioned to you when I was there, I was worried as well that I'd come back and just want to that the answer is to eat as much food as I can because I haven't been able to. And actually it's not. It's just been a real appreciation for those foods that I love.
See, I kind of envy you a little bit that you have that relationship with food coming back. Because, like I say, my appetite hasn't really fully come back, and I haven't had that feeling with food yet, surprisingly. I mean, it absolutely blew Sarah's mind that the first meal I decided to cook upon returning home was an aubergine curry and rice. She was like, "What?" And I'm baffled by this as well. You froze there. You froze like that for me for ages.
It's just so wrong. I went to my friend's and she'd ordered a couple of gusto meals with rice. And I said, I just want 1 tablespoon of rice because I just never want to eat rice again. At the moment, I'm still so adverse to eating rice.
Well, my theory behind this, and this is where I'm sitting with it at the moment, because I was saying to Sarah the other day, like I really needed to figure out like why that was the food I wanted. Like I had all this choice. Why did I want to have what I've basically just had for the last month? And I mean, I did make the addition of adding some salmon to it, so it was slightly different. And I think it ties into that I wasn't very well. So I do think the whole appetite not coming back and the my relationship with food not having as much satisfaction at the moment does tie into having been very ill with a virus because when you're ill, you know, all of that gets unsettled, doesn't it? But I really wanted something felt plain. It felt like something I could tolerate in my stomach and felt like I wanted something that felt familiar for me. And weirdly, that was Korean rice because I mean, prior to going to India, that wouldn't have been the food that felt familiar to me. But over this last month, that did become my new norm in terms of eating, and it became what was familiar for me. And I find that really fascinating in myself to see how how quickly I've adapted to what is a new norm or a new familiar, because that was what I craved as a form of comfort.
Well,
Mm.
I have another theory. I think that your brain has just forgotten that there's other better foods because they weren't available for 3.5 weeks. It's forgot
Could
that
be
there are
that.
other foods that are normally I'd love aubergine. Normally, an aubergine curry, if you said that to me 2 months ago, would have made absolute sense. But
Mm.
not now, not that mushy cooked vegetables and curry. No thanks.
Still got some left in the fridge.
Enjoy. Um, but thank you, Rebecca, for coming on and having this conversation. I kept forgetting it was being recorded.
Thank you for having me here. It's been really interesting to speak about the experience because I think we didn't even get on the same flight home together, did we? So we haven't really had this opportunity to sit and actually like talk about it so freely and openly. And it's just really also interesting to see the things that you remember or the things that stuck out for you or where things came up for you and where they came up for me because they're actually quite different. Mm.
Yeah, indeed. Different, some similarities and some differences.
Mm.
But yeah. Well, thanks everyone for watching and for the people who suggested that we do this. I think this was
Yeah.
a great I think this was a great conversation. I think it was great. I enjoyed it anyway.
Well, you will because you communicate yourself really effectively, Sarah. I probably won't listen to this for years because I'll be like, I don't want to hear myself.
Oh, Becca, I think yeah, let's talk about this afterwards. Becca judges her communication capacity, and I think you're a pretty good communicator. I think you just don't hear it.
Thanks.
But anyway.
Maybe the listeners can tell me.
So, when are we going back to do our 500 hours, eh?
Oh, yeah, ask me about that in a year's time.
All right then, Becca. Well, thanks for coming on and having this conversation, and I will speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon.